All right. Is everybody, just by the way, is everybody able to hear me okay? Okay. I was giving a sermon at a church I was visiting a couple of weeks ago, and somebody came up after the service and said, your sermon was very good. You spoke so quietly that I had to pay attention to every word in order to hear you. So it was, I want to talk a bit about, as I mentioned before, the concept of Eros in this third talk. And so as we finished last time, I mentioned this concept of theosis, divinization or deification. It's a really important foundational concept for us as Orthodox Christians, for our Orthodox theology. It's something that I think is quite unique and differentiating how we understand salvation compared to other confessions of Christianity. And, this isn't just some kind of novel concept in Orthodox theology. It goes back to some of the really formative phases of theology. So there is, of course, St. Athanasius. I think many people are familiar with this phrase of his, that God became man so that man might become God. And we also read in St. Basil, who was sort of the next generation of Orthodox confessors and great bishops and theologians. He says that man is a creature who's commanded to be God. So not only are we given the opportunity by God's grace to become gods ourselves, but really it's what we're commanded to do. Well, how is that? Well, we say that we hear in the epistle of St. John that God is love. And so we are commanded by Christ when he's discussing, the two great commandments of the law. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, with all thy strength. To love our neighbor as ourselves. So we're commanded to love itself, because God is love. And we're commanded to love his image in man, our fellow human beings, as ourselves. So again, this goes back to the notion of this community of being, which is really, I think, the essence of the mystery of the church, of redeemed humanity, that we experience this communion of love, just as the Holy Trinity exists for all eternity in a communion of love. This is how God is love. We too are called to share this unity of purpose, of will, of being, through a communion of love. And so, as we've been talking, I think a theme that's come up many times over the course of the day, of how Christian life is much more than just an ethical system. It's more than about following the rules. We're called to be gods and to reign with Christ in glory for all eternity. So the focus of our Christian life should not just be outward and ethical, the box checking. Christian life, truly lived, is an inward and mystical life. It's life itself. It's a matter of our heart. Son, give me thine heart. As Brother Gabriel quoted from Proverbs. So this has to be the focus of our spiritual effort. To cleanse our heart, to make it pleasing to God, not simply to act in a certain way to be a, quote unquote, good person. We're called to be holy people. And that's a very different standard than what the world considers to be simply a good person. Well, how do we avoid complacency and smugness and lukewarmness or spiritual burnout and actually get past this external surface of our faith so that we can actually nurture a zeal for spiritual life that is sustainable, that's healthy? As again, in St. Gregory of Nyssa, one of his most famous phrases, that even in the next life, we move from glory to glory, from strength to strength, as it says in the Psalms. Well, let's take a step back and just consider that wellspring of initial zeal that I think all of us have had at some point for spiritual life. We come to Christ through different paths. And myself and many of the monks are converts, adult converts to Orthodoxy. I think how many here were born Orthodox? So, whether we are converts or cradle, as we often say, even for those who are raised in the faith, there has to be, at some point in our lives, we have to consciously come into a willing acceptance of the faith, a willingness to actually live a Christian life. And being raised in the church is, of course, a great foundation, but all of us face this choice. And so at some point, we wouldn't be here today if we didn't make that choice. And of course, this comes about through God's grace. Christ says, "No man can come to me except the Father call him." It's a mystery. But I think we can say what happens is that at a certain point, we fall in love with Christ. We come to some sort of perception. Our spiritual eyes are opened by God's grace, and we understand the truth of who, at least in some small way, of who Christ is. We catch some glimpse, reading the Gospels, or maybe it's, our participation in the services. We consider the solemnities of Holy Week, of Christ's Passion, the beauty of his moral teaching, or the beauty of his self-sacrifice on the cross. And our hearts are touched. There's a spiritual beauty. As Father Gabriel mentioned earlier, the cross really is about beauty. The beauty of the love that it expresses. So, we're made in the image of God's love, and because of this, I think we are fundamentally motivated by desire, right? We love, and we're drawn to the people and the things that we love. It may differ for each one of us, our interests, our likes, preferences, but we act in our daily lives on the force of desire. Now, in our fallen state, we often misdirect that desire. We seek our fulfillment in material things, in base things, power, wealth, food, drugs, sex, whatever it is. Or, we can even rely on other people, human relationships, merely human love, whether it's romantic love, the love of our family members. But you see, the problem is that because we are made in God's image, because we have an immortal soul, our soul isn't satisfied with these limited realities. There's a boundless energy that's contained, this divine spark within us. And so when we just immerse ourselves in the things of the earth, we end up being frustrated and dissatisfied. Our desire thinks it's going to find satisfaction, but ultimately it remains unfulfilled. It remains barren. We remain restless. But at some point in our life, I'm sure all of us have tasted God's grace that pulls us out of this flow of passionate desires and lifts our heart, our soul, our mind towards higher things, towards a higher desire. And when we come to that moment of faith in Christ, I think we can all recognize the satisfaction of knowing that we have found, we sing it at the end of every liturgy, we found the true faith. I remember, having grown up more or less with a relativistic idea of religion and morality, just what a shocking statement that was. We found the true faith. But our heart recognizes the value when we come to love God and we accept orthodoxy. But for those who are converts, and I would imagine for those who, whether we're born in it, we have that conversion experience. And so we can live off of that for a time. Coming to orthodoxy, I can say, from the outside, it's, you're kind of like a kid in a candy shop at first. There's just so much to take in. The services, the thousands of years of history, saints' lives, and hymnography, iconography, and of course the sacraments themselves, theology. But, it all seems so kind of enchanted and grace-filled at first. But then over time, this kind of sensation dulls a little bit. It fades. That initial sweetness we call the honeymoon period. I think it's true with orthodoxy. It can be true with any number of relationships or circumstances. It can be kind of, how would you say, confusing. We think that it seems so great at one time, and then all of a sudden it starts to fade, and we think, well, what's wrong? But this is really kind of the normal course of spiritual life. The Israelites crossed the Red Sea and experienced, witnessed these miraculous manifestations of God's almighty power. But then they had to spend 40 years in the wilderness before they reached the promised land. Christ was baptized in the Jordan, and the Trinity revealed itself for the first time to humanity. But then he went into the desert for 40 days and fasted in preparation for his earthly ministry. So we see that this is simply how we grow spiritually. We receive this revelation, you might say. We receive an experience of God's grace. It moves us through desire, through this capacity for love towards what's good. But then we find that we don't always have the capacity to sustain that desire. So then the question becomes, is it even possible? I think why, we might ask ourselves, why do we lose this zeal? Well, I think, first of all, we can misplace that desire. As I mentioned before, maybe before we were misplacing it into earthly, sensual kinds of things, but when we come to a more serious appreciation for the faith, when we try to live a spiritual life, we can misplace our attention and our desire as well. We get invested in reading lots of books of lofty theology, or church politics, or church history. We want to form the correct opinion about everything, but we don't really work on our hearts. So it's kind of like our faith, it becomes like in the parable of the sower. One of the seeds gets cast on shallow ground. It springs up really quickly, but then when temptation comes, it withers away. If we don't make that effort to deepen our spiritual life, then the temptations of the world will sweep us away, or our passions. And the other seed gets choked by thorns, right? So once we lose that initial fervor, it's easy for us to get caught into our daily routines. We just kind of go through the motions. Once we become accustomed to making our spiritual effort, going to church regularly, trying to pray, then it can just become a matter of mindlessly reciting prayers. Maybe we go to church, but we're still thinking about the work or the work week during liturgy. Maybe we try to fast. Maybe we do it kind of haphazardly, half-heartedly. We do it more out of habit than out of a real desire for Christ. But of course, there's a fourth option here in the parable, which is what we really want: the seed that falls on good ground and brings forth fruit, some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. And so, unless we struggle properly with patience, with discernment, that initial zeal, that initial experience of God's grace that we have will remain barren and unfruitful. We have to till the ground of our hearts, so to speak, with appropriate spiritual labors, so that the seed of God's word can be planted there deeply and be watered and nurtured by the grace of the church sacraments. Our hearts are stony and hard. They're damaged by the sinful inheritance of our fallen nature. And so it requires effort and labor to clear the ground in order to activate that grace that we're given when God calls us to him. So if our concern is to nurse, to sustain that desire, that initial desire, we should try to think a little bit more clearly about what is its precise nature. Well, St. Gregory of Nyssa has this definition, you might say. He says, love that's strained to intensity is called Aeros. I want to say that, we have these different ideas of what love really means. In Greek, there are multiple different words. The one we hear most often in the New Testament is agape, which is sometimes rendered in English as charity. It's this sort of self-sacrificing, self-giving sort of love. But I want to talk about this concept of eros. it often has the connotation in English, is where we get the word erotic. That is something associated with sexual desire. But, in the discourse of the Church Fathers, it takes on a broader meaning. As we see in St. Gregory of Nyss's definition, he calls Eros love that's strained to intensity. Dr. Timothy Petitsas, who is a contemporary Greek theologian, defines it as the love that makes us forget ourselves entirely and run towards the other without any regard for ourselves. This, I think, of course, it characterizes what we often call romantic love, this idea of falling in love with somebody. But I think in a spiritual sense, it also characterizes the nature of that desire that we have for Christ when our heart senses his spiritual beauty. And in any event, it's this power of Eros, of the desire, that pulls us out of ourselves and shapes our life in all sorts of ways. You might even say that we are fundamentally erotic creatures in the sense that we like what we like. We're constantly drawn out of ourselves by this desire for love, seeking satisfaction in the people and the things that we desire. We try to expand the boundaries of our life, of our being, so that we can unite and integrate the objects of our desire into the sphere of our own existence. If you want to understand in a more practical sense what I'm trying to get at, just think about what happens when you do something that you love, when you're doing something that you love to do. You say, well, we lose track of time. It seems to, just to fly by. Our mind is active. It's engaged in the task at hand. We're totally attentive. We may even forget to eat or to drink or to sleep. We're so invested in what we're trying to do that our normal bodily needs are pushed to the side. And I think we can also say something similar happens when we're around those that we love. To be in love is an example of what we're talking about. When you want to be with someone as often as you can, you're apart, you can't stop thinking about them. Constantly preoccupied with your relationship with them. If you upset them, you're anxious about how to win their favor back. We even call it being love sick. You can lose your appetite, become so anxious that you can't sleep. You feel as though you would do anything for this person without even sparing your own life. So these are what you might call everyday experiences that we have, Eros. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with sexual desire per se. But I think the important thing for us to consider is that it's desire, it's this power of Eros that shapes our attention. It brings us outside of ourselves and puts us into communion with the world around us. And so when we're thinking about prayer, when we're thinking about spiritual life, that's the important thing. We have to try to nurture this divine Eros. If we want our attention to be fixed on Christ, if we want our attention to be fixed on the needs of those around us, if we want to enter into genuine Christian love for our neighbor, it has to be moved by this divine eros, not simply by a sense of obligation, of moral obligation, of duty. That only gets us so far. That if we rely exclusively on that, that's when we start to get brittle and burnt out. There's just one other thing to consider too, when we're talking about this concept of eros, we also have this colloquial sense in English of the word passion. We say, oh, writing is my passion. And of course, I think this can get confused because when we read the writings of the fathers, ascetical literature, they're talking about passions. It's very bad. Fighting against the passions. And so we have to understand that this kind of colloquial sense of passion is not quite the same thing. Otherwise, we might get the sense that in order to be good Christians, in order to live a spiritual life, we have to become some sort of, joyless automaton that has no feeling, no, life in them, no personality. And of course, in the examples of the saints, we see that this is far from the case. Timothy Petitsis, again, the Greek theologian, defines this colloquial sense of passion as sustained and committed longing. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. In that sense, we have to have passion, a passion for Christ. A longing that is sustained over a long period of time, over the whole course of our life. It's an expression of our commitment, of our love for him. So when we hear the word dispassion in the ascetical literature, we have to understand that it's not talking about this sense of in English, we have the word apathy, where, you just don't care about anything. That's not what dispassion means. That's not what apathia, that's the Greek word. Dispassion, in fact, is really just the sort of the negative space, you might say, within which true divine eros can blossom and manifest itself. Dispassion is just eros, desire, directed properly. It is the restoration, the proper ordering of the faculties of our soul that are disordered because of the fall. So because it's disordered, we seek the fulfillment of our desire in limited created things. But they're not really capable of satisfying our deepest longing, which is for God. Instead, this disease that we inherit from the fall, called self-love, philaphtia is the word in Greek. It stifles this movement of eros, prevents it from really reaching beyond ourselves and just turns our desires back in on ourselves. So you might consider the passion of lust be kind of a textbook example. Someone's physical form catches our eye and it attracts our desire, moves us outside of ourselves. But, instead of actually coming to take a genuine interest in another person, we can just remain simply at the level of being captivated with our own sensations and feelings of physical pleasure. We turn this other person simply into an object, an idol, that we use as an instrument to gratify our own desires. And so we actually shut ourselves off from the possibility of having a proper relationship, a proper loving communion, where we see the image of God in someone else and can relate to them accordingly as a spiritual being. And same process can happen with any other sort of material thing. You can have it with respect to food. Instead of eating it with thanksgiving, with gratitude, with a recognition that it's God's gift to sustain our life in this world, we simply focus on our enjoyment of the food. We become ensnared by the desire for pleasure, and so we overeat. We forget God, and our minds become dulled by the sensation of bodily pleasure. So our Eros fizzles out because we fail to direct it consistently towards our highest good, the highest aim. And it's very hard for us to reorient ourselves. That's why it's called being hooked, right? We say we're hooked on something. It means you'll go back to that same physical pleasure again and again, even though you experience the law of diminishing returns, even though you know it's not going to be as satisfying this time as it was last time. And so then we seek for different ways of exciting more pleasure, of wringing as much pleasure out of our existence as we can. Even when we know it's bad for us, even when we know it's not really going to satisfy us. How do we free ourselves from this, you might say, prison of desire? Well, going back to what I said before about our initial conversion, we can think about the spiritual desire, the Eros, that seized us in our initial conversion to Christ. So, again, we can get immersed in material things. We can also, when we try to live a spiritual life, as with Father Gabriel and I have mentioned at various points today, we can try to turn it into some kind of self-help program. We try to pull ourselves up by our spiritual bootstraps, so to speak. We turn the practice of fasting simply into a diet. We try to push through the hunger just by sheer willpower. We read spiritual books and we apply the things that we read there without ever consulting an actual priest or spiritual father. We build up some kind of false image in our minds of what a good Christian ought to be. And we try to conform ourselves to this rigid stereotype. And then, we drive ourselves crazy, basically. This is how people end up getting burned out, because they form unrealistic expectations of what Christian life really requires of them. They don't struggle in the right way. So this too is Eros, but it's gone awry. Because it's still focused on our ego, on ourself. That movement of Eros gets stifled. We have to realize that the only way out of this trap of self-love is by learning to keep our desire fixed squarely on Christ, and to remember that St. Paul says, I strove to know nothing among you except Christ and him crucified. We understand that the Christ that we love, who called us to himself, is precisely the crucified Christ. We, of course, desire consolation, spiritual joy, peace, all of these blessings, spiritual blessings. And we think if we're not getting these kinds of feelings out of our spiritual life consistently, then we're doing something wrong. But we have to recognize that if we really, truly love Christ, then we're also called to suffer with him. We have this image of Christ that we bring out during Holy Week, called the bridegroom. Hopefully all of you are familiar with what I'm talking about. It's Christ clothed in the red robe of mockery, with his hands bound. He's holding the reed that was used to beat him over the head by the Roman soldiers. It's as a royal staff. So we see our bridegroom set before us, battered and bloodied. Well, if we think for a second about the wedding ceremony in the Orthodox Church, what happens? The spouses are crowned with crowns. See, the crown of the martyrs. They drink from the same cup to express the spiritual union that's taking place. So if Christ is the bridegroom of our soul, that means we also have to be crowned with a crown of thorns. That means we too have to drink from the cup of suffering that he drank of. This was his test to the apostles, whether they're truly his disciples. If you remember, before he was going to his passion, John and James, their mother came up to Christ asking to put her sons at his right hand and left hand in his kingdom. And he said, well, can you drink the cup that I would drink of? He means, can we carry our cross? Can we go to our own Golgotha with him? The problem is that our ego, our self in its fallen state, stubbornly refuses to do just that. Because it knows deep down, I think we sense, that really embracing the cross means the death of our self-will, of our selfishness. But it's exactly this stubborn refusal to embrace the cross, to really take our desire, the power of Eros, and nail it to the cross, to put the full force of our desire into it. That's why we just, coast along from year to year without ever seeming to make any real spiritual progress. It's why we still remain cold and indifferent. It's because we never take that decisive step, crucifying our Eros, taking our selfish desires and nailing them to the cross. It's easy enough to say that we love God, but we have to ask ourselves too, how much are we willing to suffer for him? St. Silouan the Athonite, again, says that there's this direct correlation between our capacity to love and our capacity to suffer. He says that the greater the love, the greater the sufferings of soul. What is more pleasant, more delightful, more consoling than to know and experience God's incomparable love? This is why we love him, because he first loved us. We first experienced that love. Well, we have to understand that we can only grow in our capacity to experience that love to the extent that we can grow in our capacity to bear with suffering. I just want to make a note that I'm not talking about some form of self-flagellation. This also doesn't cut it. That word self is still in there. Repentance does not mean simply feel bad about yourself, beat yourself up. That's only going to lead us to despair. We have to remember that it's not simply a matter of how much physical suffering we can bear with, how hard we can push ourselves in fasting, how many prostrations we can do. There's also such a thing as inner suffering. It's perfectly possible to push ourselves to physical asceticism simply out of pride and vainglory. And when we do it in a self-willed way without spiritual guidance, that's exactly what it engenders. A sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride. It's no different than an athlete pushing himself, training himself so that he can, perform and show off his skill. St. Silouan says that love engenders sufferings of soul. There's an inner suffering that alone has the power to cleanse our hearts and to make it more receptive to God's love. So if we really want to come to know Christ, if we want to be united to him, we have to become acquainted with what the Fathers call pain of heart. It's really only this pain of heart that has the ability to cast out our innate love for pleasure, our innate selfishness that's nested in our hearts as a result of the fall. It's not just bodily suffering. Even the sensation of physical pain can become an addiction. It's what happens when people engage pathologically in self-harm. It produces some sort of chemical response in their brains. So what are we talking about when we say pain of heart? Well, I think we can define it as simply a tightening or constriction of our heart that comes about as a result of something sorrowful, something painful that happens to us. This constriction is the narrow way. This is the narrow way that leads to the kingdom. We don't have to go running here and there looking for it. There's a 20th century Russian elder, Abbot Nikon, who has a series of letters to his spiritual children. And he says there, very similar to what St. John Chrysostom says, that the only path to salvation that's really open to us in our kind of spiritually barren times is simply the endurance of suffering, involuntary suffering and misfortune, with humility, with gratitude. We go through our life filled with these anxieties, filled with self-concern, and really at bottom, we're afraid of death. This is, St. Paul even says that it's this fear of death is what keeps us in bondage to sin. We fear perhaps physical death, but I think even more so, we fear the death of our ego. Because there is sort of an inner death that occurs when our dreams or our aspirations don't come to fruition, when our hopes are dashed, when our desires are frustrated, when our love for others is not requited, when we're abused or mistreated or insulted by others, or maybe when we make mistakes and embarrass ourselves in front of others. Perhaps we make bad choices in our life and we feel like we lose control. So we expend vast amounts of mental, emotional, material energy trying to protect ourselves from all of the unpleasantness of life. And yet, misfortune still finds a way to get to us. And honestly, we have to understand that in a paradoxical sense, if we do have a carefree, untroubled life that's just full of pleasure, that the saints say that means God has abandoned us. It's precisely the difficulties, the unpleasantness, the challenges and struggles of our life that are the providential opportunities God gives to us to grow spiritually. You know, oftentimes we ourselves may be insensitive or unaware of our own faults, of the things that might be holding us back. And a lot of times it's misfortune that acts as a wake-up call. There are many, many people who, have led sinful lives, were far away from God, but it was misfortune, illness, tragedy that woke them up and brought them to repentance. So we often hear, kind of atheistic, unbelieving people ask how such, if God is so good, if he's real and he's so good, how come there's so much evil in the world? But, this line of questioning fails to take into account the reality of our sin. It's the same kind of sentiment that was uttered by the thief on the cross, the bad thief, when he was there hanging from the cross next to Christ. We remember he said, if you're really the Son of God, then come down from the cross and save us. On the other hand, the good thief said, well, don't you fear God? Can't you see that while he's suffering unjustly, we are actually receiving the due reward of our sins? So these are our two choices, the two options that we have to respond to suffering. Either to accept it humbly as a purification for sin, or to say, why, God? Make it go away. Now, this notion of fear of God and pain of heart are closely related. St. Mark the ascetic defines the fear of God as pain of heart that's endured in a spirit of devotion. See, the wicked thief was not able to bear the pain of heart in a spirit of devotion. He was incapable of saying, God is just, I'm a sinner, and I receive what I deserve. Instead, he blasphemed God and asked why he wouldn't bring his suffering to an end. So if we follow the example of the good thief, then we'll find that suffering, the suffering in our life, the unavoidable suffering that we encounter in our life, will actually cleanse our hearts and bring it closer to God. It closes off our heart's desire for pleasure, and it makes room, opens up room for us to experience more of God's grace, more of God's love. As it says in the Psalms, we'll be chastened in wisdom. We'll be disciplined, taught, instructed, freed from the weight of earthly desire, so that we can that much more eagerly run towards Christ. It's in a strange way, it's this constriction, this inner constriction in our heart that's brought about by troubles, that actually has the power, like kindling a fire, to kindle that flame of desire that's inside of it, that we have the capacity for, that we experience in fits and starts, but that really our salvation consists in trying to light that flame unceasingly. And it's precisely that flame that's the wellspring of heartfelt, attentive prayer, and also of healthy asceticism. We see this expressed in the Psalms in several places. Hopefully we're familiar with Psalm 21. It's a rather long psalm, but it very clearly prophesies the crucifixion of Christ At one point it says, they pierced my hands and my feet. But it also says at one point, the psalmist in the person of Christ is saying, I am poured out like water and scattered are all my bones. And then in the next breath, he says, my heart has become like wax melting in the midst of my bowels. All the saints of our church see in this image an expression of the spiritual fire that's kindled through suffering. In another psalm, Psalm 38, he says, my sorrow was stirred anew, and right after, immediately, my sorrow was stirred anew, my heart grew hot within me, while I mused a fire burned. And old Paisios puts it quite bluntly, St. Paisios of Manathos, to pray with the heart we must hurt. So this is genuine asceticism. This is the wellspring of prayer. Suffering born out of love for the crucified Christ, which purges our heart of its love for pleasure, warms and softens it like wax melting in the fire, constricts and focuses it, nails it down to the inner cross of the will of God. But before we decide to take it upon ourselves to show initiative and to bear special self-chosen sufferings, all we have to do is simply first learn to bear humbly with the suffering that we don't choose. So once we learn to embrace all of the unpleasant things of our life, pain of heart, once we experience this cleansing and liberating power of suffering, then we realize that on the other side of our pain, there is a new and an inexhaustible life that God opens up to us. The resurrection always follows upon the crucifixion. And when we deepen our faith in this mystery, this mysterious spiritual process of our sanctification, then we may even start to understand the mentality of the martyrs who thirsted for suffering. They went joyfully to unimaginable torment. It says so often in the Synaxarion that their faces were radiant like they were going to their own wedding feast, as they were being escorted to the stadium to be, eaten alive by lions or put on, a torture wheel. But we have to be decisive if we want to experience this martyric mentality. See, we find, again, all of these spiritual sentiments expressed so beautifully and perfectly in the Psalms. Psalm 56, ready is my heart, O God, ready is my heart. In Psalm 37, he says, I am ready for scourges. I'm ready to be whipped. My sorrow is continually before me. We see that Christ himself thirsted for his passion. When he was approaching Jerusalem towards the end of his earthly ministry, in Mark's gospel, it records for us that he walked in front of his disciples. He walked at the head. He led them. This was unusual. The disciples didn't understand, but it expressed the urgency of his desire to accomplish the salvation of the world through his own self-offering on the cross. And so he calls us too to take up our cross, to follow him, to our own Golgotha. He says elsewhere in the Gospels, I came to kindle fire, to bring fire to the earth. And how I wish it were kindled already. This fire is the divine Eros that we've been talking about. And he desires that it be kindled in each one of our hearts. We have to understand that if we don't make this resolution, if we don't really strive to cut off our self-will from the root, then we'll never realize the full potential of our nature to become deified, to become gods, as we are commanded to do. Just to sum everything up that we've been talking about, I would like to share with you this passage from one of the epistles of St. Ignatius of Antioch. So I hope you're all aware he was one of the first Christian bishops. Tradition actually tells us that he was the child that Christ picked up on his knees, and he said, "Let the little children come to me." And he ended up being killed for his faith in Christ. And so, towards the end of his life, he was being escorted from the city of Antioch to Rome to be martyred. And he wrote various epistles to the churches that he was going to visit along the way. And at a certain point, he caught wind that the Christians in Rome were trying to find a way to get his sentence commuted so that he wouldn't be put to death. And he wrote ahead to them to tell them, "Stop. Don't do anything. Don't ruin this for me. I want this." It's hard for us to imagine, but this is the desire that the saints have for suffering with Christ, because they understand that it alone is our entrance into the eternal kingdom. And there's one particular passage that expresses, I think, the intensity of St. Ignatius' desire most beautifully. He says, "The ends of the world and the kingdoms of this age shall profit me nothing. It's better for me to die for Christ's sake than to reign over the ends of the earth. I seek him who died for us. I desire him who rose again for our sake. The birth pangs are upon me. Understand me, brethren. Do not hinder me from living. Do not wish me to die. While I desire to belong to God, do not give me over to the world, nor entice me with material things. Let me attain to the pure light. Once I'm there, I shall be human. Permit me to be an imitator of my God's sufferings. If anyone has him within himself, then let him understand what I desire and suffer with me, knowing what compels me. The prince of this world is determined to snatch me away and corrupt my resolve towards God. Therefore, let no one among you aid him, but rather be on my side, which is to say, on God's side. Do not speak of Jesus Christ and yet desire the world. Let there not be any evil influence among you. Neither be persuaded by me if I entreat you when I'm present. Rather give credence to the things that I now write to you. For while I live, I write to you, longing to die. He uses there longing, the verb form of Aeros in Greek. My love, my Aeros, is crucified, and the flame of love for material things is not within me, but instead living water that speaks in me, saying to me from within, come unto the Father. I have no delight in corruptible food or the pleasures of this life. I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of Christ from the seed of David. And I desire for drink his blood, which is love, that is agape, incorruptible. I think that just about says it all. So, are there any questions? Yes?
But we read it as a whole mountain, and now that counter over and over is expressed about philological, and we might understand the concept a little bit. I would really appreciate a condensed definition and how we can revise it.
That's an excellent question. That is, it's one of those Greek words that there's really not a good English equivalent for. It literally means love of honor, and I think it might, to me, literally it seems kind of counterintuitive to what Saint Paisius seems to be talking about when he goes on at length about philotimo. But I think perhaps a good way of understanding that love of honor is that it's a sense of spiritual nobility. It's a deep sense of our self-worth as human beings who are called to be God. And so it means we act in a way that upholds, the honor and nobility of our true nature. Not in a proud sense, but in the understanding that our calling as our vocation as human beings, regardless of, the particular circumstances of our life, but all of us are called to something unimaginably lofty, eternal life in communion with God and his kingdom. And so often we just are not cognizant of that on any level. We just are immersed in our earthly life, cares, our pleasures, and we forget God, we forget eternity, we forget the kingdom. And so we act in a way that's base, lowly. And that, I think, fundamentally characterizes sin and passion. That philotimo, a sense of our spiritual, the high calling of our life, the true purpose of our life, means that we're going to then act with a good disposition. That's the other thing, it seems to me, that St. Paisius emphasizes, is that it's this element of philotimo that motivates us to struggle, that motivates us to act in a God-pleasing way, not out of a sense of external duty or obligation, but really from a love for God, a love for Christ. Is that helpful? Anyone else?
I guess I'll ask a question. Something I thought about previous about prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for someone that has kids,
Mm-hmm.
right, it's kind of hard to find time for prayer. So normally, I was thinking about myself. I don't know how other people do it, but a lot of times I will listen to prayers and do things like wash the dishes,
Mm-hmm.
clean, but that would be usually like my morning. So I would listen to it in the car. Is that something that is totally acceptable, or should I be maybe doing something different? I don't know. How do you see this?
Well, I think finding ways of incorporating prayer into your daily life, whatever form that takes, is it's a good thing. It's for instance, at the monastery, the novices have the it's just a part of our rule of life. The novices are typically responsible for cleanup after the meals. And while they are cleaning the dishes and everything like that, they're supposed to be saying the Jesus prayer verbally, out loud, which, of course, just is meant to cut down on idle chatter and things like that. But it's just another way of bringing prayer into our daily life. But I still think that it's important to try and carve out even some small space where you can converse prayerfully with God, and removed from the activities of life, removed from other people. That's why in a monastic context, the fathers say that a monk flies to heaven on two wings. One is liturgical prayer, and the other is private prayer. So our personal prayer, private prayer time, is just as important as, listening to prayers while you do other things. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I don't think it's not fully a substitute. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to spend hours every day, in a prayer corner, because we have to, live life. We have various obligations and responsibilities. But as St. Gregory of Nyssa detailed at length, we think that we have to. Sometimes we feel like we have to put prayer to the side in order to attend to what's right in front of us, the cares of daily life. But his whole point is that, well, really, we need prayer. We need prayer to do those things. So even just finding a moment to recollect your mind and make the sign of the cross and say, "Oh Lord, bless," or something like that, before engaging in work. Taking 5 minutes at the start of, very first thing in the morning, just trying to do the Jesus prayer, the Trisagion prayer, something very simple, but not to completely neglect that private, personal aspect of our prayer. Yeah.
Also, another question about the same thing, prayer. Should, as a family, we have 4 children. Should we be doing all of our prayers with our children, or should we just do somewhere else with some of their kids, or?
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of like the same principle. You want to pray together as a family, but you also need to spend time alone in prayer as well. I think the important thing is just working with your priest to find, what's the right amount, what's something that's manageable. Praying together as a family every day, I think, is necessary for Christian families. That means there's a spiritual bond that unites you. And that's very important.
So, question on prayer. Prayer book versus your own words.
Mm-hmm.
What the best practice? Is there a time where you can pray in your own words if you feel like it, or is it better to stick to the book?
Well, before I address that, I'll just say, are there any other questions about the third talk? Because I think we're going to try to have some joint Q&A time, so maybe Father Gabriel, if you want. How are we doing on time, Father Gabriel?
You want me to answer that one? Or?
Sure, yeah.
Again, these are things that I don't think there's one generic answer for everybody. This is something to ask your spiritual father about. I think it's very important, especially for beginners in the spiritual life, which almost all of us, if not all of us, are beginners in the spiritual life, to use the prayer book very significantly, because these are men who really knew how to pray, who really achieved much greater heights than we certainly can on our own. By entering into that, they will teach us how to pray properly, how to pray in the right way for the right things. Like it says in the scriptures, how would we know what to pray for if the Spirit didn't teach us? Well, how does the Spirit teach us? Through our Father. But with that said, Just one other thing too. I think it's especially important, not that we don't do it in the monastery, but especially for lay people, when there's not the daily church services. This is a connection to the life of the church, to the prayer of the church, that everyone, all Orthodox Christians together, praying these morning, evening prayers from the book. It's very important to stay united with the church in that way. That's one of the great gifts that the church gives us. But I also don't think that it's anything exclusive. We do also need to just pour our hearts before God in a natural way. And the more that we use the book, the more we will see, what they call extemporaneous prayer, prayer from our own words. It will become richer, more meaningful, more beautiful. So it's definitely not either or. I think both are important. And probably there's a sense of progression in the Christian life that begins very, very heavily with the written prayers. And then by the end, maybe not so much, although I don't think it's ever good to leave them aside entirely. But again, that's just my opinion. Everyone is in a different place, and this is really a question to talk to your confessor about, I think.
Well, there are no more questions.
I have,
Sure. Okay.
so, uh, this is for me, but generally speaking, if someone's in a service where it's different language, aside from following, the actual physical book, let's say you bring the book, it's very easy to get distracted. Is it appropriate to say the Jesus prayer during service, or say it, or try to focus on something else, like icons in the church or something, when you don't understand word for word?
You'll hear different opinions. Leaving aside the question of not understanding the language, you'll hear different opinions from different fathers about whether it's good to say the Jesus prayer during church or not. Some say you should always pay attention only to the words of the services. Sometimes they say pay attention to the Jesus prayer, either one. Sometimes they say switch, and when you get distracted, you go to the other one. But I think most people would agree that if you don't understand the services, the Jesus prayer is wonderful. Of course, it's good to do that. It's maybe not the only option available to you, but I think very few people would. I mean, maybe Father Basil disagrees, but I don't know of very many people who would say not to say the Jesus prayer in a situation like that.
Okay. Any other suggestions?
The more that you know the service itself, the more the language will not become as important. Especially, it's very easy with the liturgy because it's almost all the same. If you're going to go to Matins or Vespers, maybe it's a little bit more difficult, but the grace of the Holy Spirit is there. The holy mysteries are there. The holy icons are there. Of course, not to at all downplay the importance of the liturgical texts. They're very important, but just because we're deprived of one form of grace, if we are, God will always give us a different form of grace instead. It's like with people, the early monks who weren't able to receive Holy Communion very often because they weren't priests, they were out in the desert. God gave them grace in other ways. But that, of course, we are obligated to take advantage of what God does give us. And I thought, well, the fathers, St. Mary of Egypt, she didn't go to church, so why should I go to church? Like, obviously, it's a completely different situation. But if through outside of your own control, you can't take advantage of one thing, God will give you something else instead.
Like a typical day at your monastery, can you describe that?
Sure. Yeah.
What time do you get out?
Well, our daily morning services typically start around. They start at 5. So
5 a.m.
Yeah, 5 a.m. And I would say, each monk also has a private rule of prayer for the cell. So many people will get up prior to the morning service in order to fulfill some or all of their prayer rule. So, the exact time that everybody gets up is a little bit different, but we all gather in church by 5 a.m. And we do Mass and liturgy. So that's usually over sometime around 8 o'clock. And then we begin work at 9. So we have a morning work period from 9 to noon. And we reconvene in church for the 6th hour. And then we have lunch immediately after that. We resume work at 1:30 until about 4:30, or then the evening service starts at 5 p.m. Vespers, dinner. We have compline at 6:30, and the day ends around 7:15, something like that. So, and then we have basically the bell that tolls for, in advance of all the services. It will also, the bell will ring at 9 p.m., which initiates a nightly period of silence. So from 9 p.m. until 9 a.m. the following morning, there's no, conversation or anything like that goes on. Sometimes, maybe there will be some emergencies or necessities or anything like that, but otherwise there's silence from 9 to 9. And then, that's kind of a typical day. When we have, great feasts, Sundays, things like that, then we'll have a vigil at 6:30, and we start later the next day, 9 a.m. hours in liturgy. So that's sort of the shape of our liturgical life. Do you have any other questions about the
You
law?
have your private reading that you want to read, the reading will be after you retire or accompanying.
There are various, there are kind of times throughout the day, either after the morning service or in the middle of the day. There's a little bit of a respite after compline to do, reading, or some monks have like morning and evening portions of their cell rule. Others, it's not quite so. It's not confined to a particular time of day, so that there's an element of flexibility there in terms of what between each monk and his spiritual father. But certainly the cell rule is a common element.
We try to design our liturgical life so that as many of the brothers as possible can be at all of the church services, but the individual rule of prayer and reading varies fairly widely depending on people's circumstances and strengths and what they themselves need. But as Father Basil said, it's universal. Some monasteries, they so heavily favor the liturgical life and the other obediences that there's very little private prayer. But as Father Basil mentioned earlier, we try to make sure that everyone has both, but what that looks like varies quite a bit as far as the private rule.
And you also have a parish, do you have parishioners or no?
Well, that's an interesting question. When the monastery moved to West Virginia in 2000, a growing number of people began to use it as a parish. Eventually, there was a regular parish founded about 15, 20 minutes down the road to try to absorb a good deal of that. There are still a few parishioners who, for one reason or another, it's not convenient either in terms of their circumstances, their spiritual life, to go to the parish, and so some do come. But that's more an exception than the rule, although of course our guest house is full basically all the time, so there are pilgrims with us for nearly all of the services.
So on Sunday, do you celebrate like liturgy for the parish?
No, there's an assigned priest for the parish. So just the brotherhood clergy, or unless especially Father Basil, but a lot of times we are called to fill in for some area parish if the priest is out of town. But aside from that, everyone serves at the monastery on Sunday liturgy for the monks and whatever pilgrims and a few parishioners. Are you stretching, or you have a question?
First off, how many monks are at the West Virginia monastery, and then what are the methods that you guys go about for supporting yourselves and everything?
Well, we have about 26 monastics, and we do engage in a variety of labors to help support ourselves economically. So we produce incense. It's actually probably our biggest industry, but we also produce a variety of like bath and home items: soap, bar soap, liquid soap, lotion, beeswax candles, honey, which we sell all the things on our website. So if you haven't been to our website or our online store, we've got a pretty broad array of items for purchase. And then, the rest of our expenses are covered by donations from pilgrims, from people, friends of the monastery. So
It's not precisely an economic labor, but one of the main ministries that I think it was maybe Father Basler, one of the fathers was mentioning last night. Our abbot, Father Seraphim, or Father David, I think, mentioned it anyway. Our abbot, Father Seraphim, before he became Orthodox many, many years ago, he was a Roman Catholic Benedictine monk, and his obedience there was as the guest master. So whether through his own gifts or through the providence of God, probably some combination of that, despite being basically in the middle of nowhere, one of the main ministries of our monastery is hospitality and offering people a place of prayer, of silence, of spiritual retreat, to which certainly we invite all of you, any of the people in your parish. We would love to, I know some of you already come, we would love to have all of you come. The other thing I would add too is Father Seraphim feels especially strongly about providing a place of rest and retreat for the clergy, for married clergy who bear much, much heavier crosses than we do. And I know even from my own limited experience that it can be very nice to just be able to stand in church and pray without anybody wanting something from you or relying on you for some sort of thing. So, Father, if you ever need a break, please come and see us.
Does Holy Cross have a YouTube channel?
we do, yeah, actually.
This is where we can revisit today's.
I haven't. I don't know exactly what the status is of the videos, but
multiple sources where we will share this.
excellent.
The majority of the YouTube channel is a ministry we started during COVID where we broadcast the daily cycle of monastic services. We used to do all of them. After things kind of got more back to normal, Father Seraphim decided to stop doing Sundays and feast days to encourage people not to just substitute us for the parish, but we still currently at least are broadcasting the daily monastic services. So if you need a little bit of prayer in your life, we do make that available. There are also a few other videos of some things about the monastery or something to try to help people in their spiritual life, but the majority of it is those daily services.
Well, since you mentioned the YouTube channel too, I'll just also mention that as essentially as part of the growth of our the sort of the ministry of hospitality, the growth of the monastic community, and also just kind of other people moving to the area to be close to the monastery. We began building a new church a couple of years ago to house everyone, because our current spaces in church and trapeze on Sundays, their feast days were kind of at capacity. So it's a miracle actually that our current trapeze is still standing. Like the floor is falling in and it's had to be replaced in certain places. I kind of say that once we get a new one built, the angels that are holding it up will disperse and it'll just kind of collapse into the ground. But so anyway, we're building a new church. The basement of it's going to be our new trapeze, and as we've been trying to also make special fundraising efforts for to finance the construction. One of the things we've been doing lately is producing some videos short fundraising videos. I don't know if you were here earlier. We had the first one that was playing on the little screen here, but we have some other videos that are that we're planning on releasing. One should be coming fairly soon, and so if you go to the YouTube channel and subscribe, then you'll be kind of up to date on things like that as well. Of course, we're trying to promote our church construction, but I think the videos that we're trying to produce also, I certainly hope, speak to a broader vision for monastic life in this country and just the role of Orthodoxy in this country and what the broader mission of the monastery is. So it's about more than just the cash.
I'm sure there's a lot of people that would love to hear things like today. And both of us are not Russian. We attend a Russian church, so it's nice to seek these things out.
Right. Well, I think the part of that big picture vision of what sort of is the unique place of our own monastery in the church, especially the Russian church abroad, is as an English speaking community composed primarily of converts. It's sort of bridging that gap between our we were once just average American guys.
Well, we might still be.
Well, I mean, now we're just average American guys that wear black robes, but we are striving for that authentic Orthodoxy, and of course we feel very blessed to be part of the Russian Church that has preserved that tradition, fleeing communism, and has kind of kept the faith, right? That's I think there's a lot of providence in that, but it's something very special to kind of assimilate that and hopefully strive towards a new expression of Orthodoxy that is more accessible to our fellow Americans. So.
Everything is completely in English, both in terms of the daily life of the monastery, also the liturgical life. If we have Russian guests, as we often do, we'll try to do what we can to by way of making them feel at home. But primarily everything is in English. As Father Basil said, we feel very much a part of the Russian Church. We feel greatly indebted to the Russian Church. Our monastic formation and heritage comes from Jordanville, and even though linguistically there's not very much in common, we try as much as we can to faithfully preserve the Russian liturgical practices, the monastic ethos of Jordanville and the fathers who have come before us, and it's something that it's not that we're trying to pretend like we are Russian, but we feel very grateful to not just be making things up on our own, trying to reinvent monastic life or Orthodox spiritual life. We've been given an extremely rich inheritance, and we want to try to spread that to people who, like ourselves, might not otherwise be able to tap into that due to not speaking one of the old country languages. But it's very interesting where we are in West Virginia. It's pretty much the middle of nowhere, and yet there's a fair number of pan-Orthodox churches in the immediate area. We have the Rokar parish that we helped found in Wayne. We have an Antiochian parish just down the road. There's a Greek parish in town, and then some OCA and some other Antiochian and Greek parishes in the surrounding area. And there's really a tremendous amount of brotherhood that exists there that God has allowed us to be a part of, and really it's a great blessing, and it's something that again we feel like as much as we can, we need to try to share, because we hear from other places, other circumstances. People don't necessarily have that. Things are more siloed and isolated, and maybe even there's some animosity, and unfortunately, we're all human. But at the same time, there was the priest at the Greek parish who's been a close friend of our abbot for many years. He's a fairly senior ranking priest, but he's still at a really middle of nowhere parish in West Virginia. And someone asked him one time, I was like, did they never offer you a better parish, a better assignment, or something like that? He said, "This is Camelot. Why would I leave Camelot?" He felt so strongly that there was such a sense of brotherhood and unity there that he didn't want to go anywhere else, even though he would have had a lot more honor and respect and probably money if he had. So it's a very blessed place that we've been allowed by God to live at. And again, we would love nothing more than to share a little bit of that with all of you if you are ever able to make the trip to come and see us.
During my last visit to monastery, I learned about how the Holy Cross Monastery is built in the mountain of Optina Monastery. I believe one of the monks actually sort of did an internship with Optina Monastery. Can you talk a little bit more about it? Is that something you want to continue to develop?
Well, I was one of several monks that's been to Optina before COVID, and now with the war, and the sanctions and everything. It's made for the past few years, it's made sending monks over there pretty much impossible. But for at least a few years before that, we really had been making a sincere effort to try and cultivate a more regular relationship with Optina Monastery, which, if any of you are not familiar with, it was kind of at the heart of a spiritual renaissance in Russia during the 19th century. It was closed by the communists and was given back to the church in the late 80s, and since then it's just kind of really resurrected. It's quite remarkable. When I was there in 2019, they had a brotherhood, I think, of about 200 monks, maybe 60 priests. Among the brothers, there's a skeet that's separate from the monastery that lives a bit more intense, strict spiritual life. So we got the chance to stay there and just really experience the tradition, right? And so our goal, we read all the lives of the elders as part of our monastic formation, during the novitiate, and so I think the elders are very close to each one of us spiritually, and it was very special to get to go there and see the places where they lived and prayed and labored, and where their relics are, and just to see what God has done in that place, through the labors of the monks there. It's genuinely inspiring. So we hope in some small way to I guess replicate that in our own context, but it's kind of, being in America, it's kind of like swimming upstream, because the faith is very, it doesn't have a long history here, and it's very small. Whereas in a place like Russia or any other historic Orthodox land, you just feel this kind of current of grace. I think from all of the saints and the martyrs and just centuries of people struggling and praying. So
at our monastery, we have a novice reading list. It's a list of, 50, 60 books that every novice is required to read. After that, it becomes the discretion of their spiritual father. But really, the backbone of that list is the lives of all of the Optina elders. That's really, in many ways, the core of the formation of the the vision of monastic life that we're trying to emulate as far as we can.
Yeah, the full relics.
yes,
Are there any stars there today? Stars like Fathers of Sin?
at Optina, you said?
Yeah, not that posted.
Yes. Well, I think there was Elder Eli I don't know. I don't think he's living there currently. I know he was there for a time, and he is kind of
The symphony starts.
someone, yeah, who kind of has a reputation for being, a kind of an authentic elder. But other than that, I don't know if there's, at least, off the top of my head or personally. I mean, we met many monks when we went there, many very men who are spiritual men, but I don't speak Russian, and we were there for a couple of weeks, so my exposure was fairly limited. But
Gonna come back around to prayer, but maybe from a different angle.
sure.
Since we seem to be a little comfort heavy, which is good. Being a convert, having now a family that consists of everything from evangelicals to Catholics to pretty mixed bag of folks, coming in and hear sometimes some reluctance and some people's downright direction to not pray with Orthodox. What's your view on? I mean, I've got family that I celebrate holidays with. How do we pray with them effectively?
Ask your spiritual father. I mean, really, it's we have to understand the purpose of those church canons that forbid praying with heterodox. The idea is that you don't want to give people the impression that it's all the same thing. That there's no difference, there's no reason to be concerned with whether you're Orthodox or non-Orthodox. That's the spirit of the canon. As far as how to apply that canon in a specific situation with specific people, especially close friends and relatives and loved ones, I think really that's something that you need to talk to your father confessor about to handle properly. Sorry for the cop-out.
Yeah.
You ever, if you're Orthodox Christians, you ever engage with the world more broadly, given the opportunities, when you find any opportunities to do that, any other lectures, or if the topic is what the world considers spiritual, where you have an opportunity to present sort of the Orthodox point of view?
I don't know if we have a lot of opportunity in like a lecture format per se. Obviously, our presence in an area of the country that's heavily Protestant, Baptist in particular, is itself kind of a witness to Orthodoxy. The mere existence of Orthodoxy, so we of course try to help those around us and even just in the course of daily life, we still have to go to the doctor, we still have to get groceries, or go to the drugstore, whatever it is. And so when monks have to go on errands like that, then of course we're engaging with the world. And I think by and large, those kinds of relationships in the broader community do a lot to, both raise people's awareness of Orthodoxy, but also it fosters a lot of goodwill, for the monastery, the presence of the monks there, which.
And really, that's the personal thing is almost always much more effective. I mean, I've been asked to go several times to church, in Charleston, which is the capital of West Virginia. Some interfaith panel talking about how we handle death and burial and things like that, or to explain to people what monasticism was. And I mean, part of it is just my own poor ability, but it's just obvious that things like that almost always fall on deaf ears, but it's when you have the opportunity to show the love of Christ to, the people right around you. I think that's, for most people at least, that's where things happen, and everything else maybe God can use everything, but my own experience has been, the more kind of formal efforts generally don't bear nearly as much fruit.
Well, if I may add to that, that's part of our ministry of hospitality, because we have a lot of non-Orthodox people in the monastery. We'll have Baptist senior groups come for, a day trip to the monastery, or we'll have, school groups or 4-H groups or homeschool groups. Most of and some of those folks have, become Orthodox as well. So a lot of it is there's a bit of myth busting, for the people who don't know who we are. And what's amazing is that we've really been adopted by the local community. So there's a story about who it was at a local Walmart, but they overheard two ladies not too far behind the monks that, one lady had never seen the monks before, was visiting, said, "What are those guys dressed all here?" And the other lady, who was local Wayne lady, said, "Those are our monks." So, just by God's grace and just, like daily interactions with the community, they consider us good Christian men, and they're very simple and not polemical, and they ask for our prayers, and they know they'll get them.
Yes.
So last question, what's the official YouTube channel that this production is going to be posted on? What's the best way to support you guys? And is there any method of coming to visit your developers? What would be the process of coming to visit sponsors?
I think the YouTube channel is, what is it?
Holy Cross WV.
Holy Cross, youtube.com/holycrosswv. But you can, go to the website. Our website is just holycross.org. And so you can learn more about the church construction project that we're doing. There's, our online store. There's, ways of donating through the website. So, if you have been edified and enjoyed your time this afternoon, we ask that you go to the website and help support the mission of the monastery. And you can we're on Facebook as well. So we post updates on the construction, the live stream, the church services. So, it's a good way to make prayer a part of your day. If you're doing the dishes or whatever, you can put Vespers on in the background or something. Yeah. So
The church is
Contacts, easy, it's on the website, you can contact to arrange a schedule of visit. So,
the church is
we're talking to they can get you some.
The church is by far the most important way to support us. As Father mentioned, we're really at capacity, not only in terms of the brotherhood, but also in terms of the guests. And this is definitely the most important thing externally that the monastery has ever done. And it's very, very vital for our continued growth and our ability to continue the work that God has given to us. The last thing real quick about the question about visiting, again, because our capacity is currently quite limited. We're booked out really far in advance, usually maybe even 6 months in advance. You might be able to squeeze something in, some cancellation or something like that. But if you do want to come, we certainly encourage you to go to the website and sort of read the background and then get in touch with us as soon as advance as possible to try to schedule something.
Online booking?
It's there's information we ask people to read online first to get an idea what they're getting into, and then there's a form they can use to contact the guest master, and then we'll get in touch with you all and let you know what availability we have.
thank you all.
It is truly me to bless thee that is good, ever blessed and most faithless and Mother of our God, for on the hold in the cherubim, and the uncomparable glorious in the seraphim, who without corruption gave Glory to God the Word, the very theotokos to remember. Glory to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. Father, bless.